Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the fifth episode of the fifth season of the Center's Religion and series. And this is our first episode for 2025, so welcome. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America. And that is just one piece of the important work that the center is doing. The last episode was a far-ranging and critically important conversation on religion and future humans featuring Sylvester A. Johnson. Had an opportunity to discuss his work and the impact that he and his work has had on the fields of American religion, artificial intelligence, surveillance, and really the future of humanities in general. Thank you, Dr. Sylvester Johnson, Andrea Jane, Leonard McKinnis, and Philip Goff for that fantastic episode. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, please check it out at our website or our YouTube channel, and you can download it anywhere where you find your favorite podcasts. We are starting this semester by asking our guests to discuss the ways in which their fields and their normative historiographies have or have not been willing to fully engage new sources, archives, or we are asking them to examine spaces that have often been imagined exhausted or that some folks in the field have grown tired of. And so this semester, we're asking folks to think about and to unsettle categories that we sometimes think of have already being settled. So we've asked our guests today to provide resources like syllabi and articles and video on our resource center, but we are also asking them to point us to the new and novel and underexplored in these resources. Because our goal with these conversations is to explore the nuance and the complexity and the many ways that these topics inform and shape religion and American culture. And I'm so excited for this topic that we are going to be looking at today. I want to remind folks that as we are exploring Catholic studies, and we have a great panel of scholars and thinkers around this area, I want you to remember that as we are having our conversation today, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to drop your questions or your comments in, because that is where our hosts and panelists can find them and can engage them throughout this hour as we have this wide-ranging and really fantastic conversation. Today's episode will be a broad conversation looking at the present state and prospects of Catholic studies 60 years after the close of Vatican II. Our panelists will be thinking about what do recent institutional crosscurrents mean for the field, what is the status of Catholic studies in the wider academy, and what are, listen here, the neglected areas in scholarship, whether historical, theological, or social scientific. And so I'm really excited that this panel is going to start us off by looking at these neglected, often overlooked, sometimes forgotten questions that are so important at the intersection of religion, institutional transformation, and the future of Catholic studies. Our hosts today are Peter Thuesen and Megan Bowen, and I'm so excited to introduce them, and they will introduce the rest of our panel for today's conversation. Peter Thuesen is a professor of religious studies at Indiana University, Indianapolis, and a co-editor of Religion and American Culture, a journal of interpretation. From 2009 to 2015, he chaired IU Indianapolis's Department of Religious Studies. He is a historian of American religion and the Christian tradition. He is an author, most recently in 2020, of Tornado God, American Religion and Violent Weather, which received the 2021 Christianity Today Book Award. And he is currently working on a project entitled The People's Cardinal, Richard Cushing and the Age of Catholic Optimism. So join me in welcoming one of our hosts, Dr. Peter Thuesen. Our other host is Megan Bowen, who is a PhD in theology candidate at Regis College in Toronto. Her research seeks to reconsider St. Augustine's theology of marriage within his socio-historical context as a means of advancing current theological discussions of marriage and of sexual ethics. Along with an MA in theology, Megan holds an MA in ethnomusicology. Beyond her academic work, Megan is involved in music and liturgy and has offered workshops on moral formation and Christian life. I've gotten a chance to know Megan as she is currently working on as a research associate with the Religious Parenting in the Episcopal Diocese of Indianapolis project, which is housed here at the center. So please join me in welcoming Peter Thuesen and Megan Bowen, and they will now take over to introduce the rest of the panelists and begin this really important conversation on religion and the future of Catholic studies.
Thanks, Joseph. And we're so happy that you've all decided to join us today. A quick word at the outset about what Megan and I mean by Catholic studies, and maybe it's obvious to most people, but I mean, most broadly, of course, it's an interdisciplinary field of inquiry that involves people in a number of disciplines who work on Catholic topics. But it can also be a curriculum or a degree track within a liberal arts context. And so in that more narrow definition, of course, it's more directly implicated in the institutional politics of particular settings. So we'll have a chance, I assume, to talk about both senses of the term Catholic studies. And because it's an interdisciplinary field, we've invited people from experts from 3 different disciplines to talk with us today on this panel. The 3 disciplines are sociology, history, and theology. I know it may sound like the beginning of a joke. A sociologist, a historian, and a theologian were in a lifeboat. But that's what we have today. And so I'm going to introduce the sociologist and the historian, and then Megan will introduce the theologian, and she will start us off with our questions. So first, the sociologist. Tricia Bruce is director of the Springtide Research Institute and an affiliated scholar at the University of Southern California's Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. A PhD graduate of UC Santa Barbara, she's the author of Parish and Place, Making Room for Diversity in the American Catholic Church, published by Oxford in 2017, and Faithful Revolution, How Voice of the Faithful is Changing the Church, published by Oxford in 2011. She's also co-editor of American Parishes, Remaking Local Catholicism, published by Fordham in 2019, and Polarization in the U.S. Catholic Church, published by Liturgical Press in 2016. Just last year, she was appointed by Pope Francis as a consultor for the General Secretariat of the Synod on Synodality, and currently she serves as president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion, which, in case you didn't know, it was founded in 1938 as the American Catholic Sociological Society. Last but not least, she's also a past speaker at our center's biennial conference. So we're pleased to have her back with us, if only virtually, here in Indianapolis. Secondly, our historian on the panel actually teaches in religious studies. So we're getting 2 for 1 with Michael Pasquier, who is the Jacques Seneva Professor of Christian Studies and Professor of Religious Studies at Louisiana State University, where he also serves as Associate Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. A PhD alumnus of Florida State University, he's the author of Fathers on the Frontier, French Missionaries and the Roman Catholic Priesthood in the United States, 1789 to 1870, published by Oxford in 2010, and Religion in America, The Basics, which recently appeared in a 2nd edition from Routledge. It's really a wonderful textbook. He's also editor of Gods of the Mississippi, published by Indiana in 2013. In 2023, he served as president of the American Catholic Historical Association. And several years ago, Mike and I discovered a shared interest in religion, weather, climate, and the environment, a field in which he co-produced and co-wrote the 2013 documentary Water Like Stone, about the people who live in Louisiana's vanishing wetlands. Last but not least, Mike is also an alumnus of our Young Scholars in American Religion program here in the center, which is our fellowship program for early career faculty. So we're very pleased to have Mike with us today too. And I'll turn it over to Megan now.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you again to our panelists for joining us. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Susan K. Wood, a professor of systematic theology. She has taught at St. Mary's College in Leavenworth, St. John's University in Collegeville, Marquette University in Milwaukee, and is currently at Regis St. Michael's in Toronto. She has held administrative positions as well at St. John's University, Marquette, and Regis College, and has served as the president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Professor Wood received the John Courtney Murray Award from the Catholic Theological Association of America in 2021 in recognition of outstanding and distinguished achievement in theology. Professor Wood is very active in ecumenical work. She has served on the U.S. Lutheran Roman Catholic Dialogue, the North American Roman Catholic Orthodox Theological Consultation, the International Lutheran Catholic Dialogue, and the conversation between the Baptist World Alliance and the Roman Catholic Church. Professor Wood has also participated in consultations on baptism, theological anthropology, and the nature and purpose of ecumenical dialogue, sponsored by Faith and Order of the World Council of Churches and the Joint Working Group. She serves on the editorial board of the journal Ecclesiology, and most of Wood's writings explore the connections between ecclesiology and sacramental theology. Her newest book, A Synodal Church, The Christian Faithful on Pilgrimage, is coming out this April, published by Rowman and Littlefield. So welcome again to all of our panelists. So we'll jump in with the first question, and I think we'll start off with Professor Wood, if you would be interested in starting first. As we approach the 60th anniversary of the close of Vatican II, are we at another inflection point in the Church's history? What do recent developments, including the recent synod, mean for Catholic studies?
Well, in a word, absolutely. I think we are at a significant turning point, culturally, as well as ecclesially in the church. And I would say culturally, we have an unprecedented migration of peoples, I think, today. We've certainly seen warfare. We've seen an ecological crisis. And I'm thinking of Tricia there in California, Southern California even. And so the world around us is changing. We're also seeing nationally a return to national isolationism among, within a number of countries, at least in Europe and the United States. This is the context for theology. And Pope Francis is really advocating a decentralized church that goes out to the periphery. And so the model of communion ecclesiology is changing. It's not the culture of Rome being spread worldwide, but it's cultural diversity and inculturation of the faith with lines of communication, discernment, and communion that have to be established among this diversity. I won't go on forever because other people get to talk.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I think is a very good kind of presentation of the context, this very important context. And I wondered, Tricia, if you would like to pick up on anything that Susan has said, or I'm curious if you have any particular insights regarding the synod, especially.
Yes, I do think we're at this really special historic moment. And it is kind of amazing, too, to reflect that how many decades we are from Vatican II, especially because I think the field of Catholic studies, and certainly my approach as a sociologist, has been very much shaped by the legacy and the impact and sort of the ongoing questions that emerged from Vatican II, and even the openness that there was in a nascent way to social science that was rather novel at the time. So that legacy holds. And yet, that here we have this incredible moment where the church has once again, in a systematic way, asked itself, who are we? Where are we going? And the person leading the charge, and Susan alluded to this, is doing it differently. You know, it's this steering away from clericalism and more to the smell of the sheep, and inviting different people to the table. I was in the Synod Hall daily, sitting not far from Pope Francis, as well as more than 350 delegates from around the world. And those faces and those backgrounds and those contexts and the positionality that were in that room absolutely look different than what was seen in Vatican II. And what that means is that we ask different kinds of questions, different concerns come to the table, and the process of deliberation and structure for what happens next all evolves differently. So to me, this is the Synod reflects this really exciting moment in the church where the table looks different. There are different people seated there, and inviting us to then think through. And I am honored also to have social science be a part of that conversation. I was one of few social scientists, more theologians in the room, but just recognizing the interdisciplinarity that it was incorporated into synodality, and the recognition that we need to be asking these hard, messy, complex questions, the kinds of questions that religion and American culture likes to ask in order to figure out who we are and where we're going.
Thank you very much.
Yes, this is happening in the midst of culture wars that are pretty serious, especially in the United States and North America. So that is a little bit of a disconnect, I think, between the synodal impulse and its implementation in our country.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Michael, if there's anything you'd like to add.
From the perspective of the field of history and Catholic history in the United States, as I speak, I'm going to be speaking primarily from the perspective, or trying to represent historians of Catholicism in the U.S. I just got back from the American Catholic Historical Association meeting a couple of months before that, the American Academy of Religion and the Catholic Studies unit, and the really wonderful programs that both of those units put on. And I'll be honest, nobody's really talking about the synod on synodality in the sense, well, I don't want to say no one. It has its place, but I would say that most historians of Catholicism in the US, or many, are not taking this moment of synodality and reacting to it or using it or somehow are motivated by the direction that the Synod is taking the Catholic Church. And I'm just speaking kind of candidly, in that everyone knows about it, everybody loves the name, and then we kind of, as historians, generally speaking, I think historians are just kind of moving on with the work that they're doing. And I can talk about why that might be, but as a initial response, it's happening in the background, it's happening now. And I think that does kind of allow us to see the differences and the different ways in which our fields are motivated or shaped or moved to study or address certain questions and problems in particular ways.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So the next question we had planned was looking at the status of Catholic studies in Catholic universities, and whether the field itself may be more polarizing in a Catholic context, and how Catholic studies fits into secular universities. Given Michael's comments, though, just in the answer to that last question, I wonder if maybe it would be helpful to think of how Catholic studies may also be interacting with other disciplines and how that may be affecting. I suppose, Michael, if we could open it up to you.
Sure. So in advance of this discussion, I tried to think about what are the graduate educations of many of our recent PhDs and even the last 10 or 20 years, and thinking about the academic and scholarly formation of historians of Catholicism in the US right now. And there's a real interesting kind of balance and mix between secular universities, either religious studies or history programs, and Catholic universities, either religious studies / theology or history programs. And I went back and looked. I used to be the program or the unit leader for Catholic studies at AAR, which is kind of the flagship of this interdisciplinary study of religion. And this is where the Catholic studies people are kind of camping out. And I had to write like the 5-year report during the 20 teens, and it was split 50-50. 50% of people who gave papers were from Catholic universities, and 50% of them were from secular universities. And when you start thinking about those people who were in those cases representing Catholic universities, many of them studied and got their PhDs at secular universities. And so this academic formation within the field of Catholic history is, I think, rather varied. And the movement between and betwixt them is really, I think, one of the exciting things about the field of Catholic history today. And I think we're long past the period in which there's some kind of tension between the two. I think historically there was, but certainly not now. And I think that's where its vibrancy and its innovations are coming from.
You, Susan or Tricia, would either of you like to jump in with anything?
Well, my concern is the loss of liberal arts in our schools, and what is that impact on Catholic studies? And in that respect, I think Catholic studies has a really strong position to play in terms of representing the liberal arts as they reach into maybe harder scientific areas or or history. If I were to talk about cautions, I would say, in some places there was a turn to the nostalgia of the 50s, in studies. And I think my caution would be that Catholic studies today has to be strongly in dialogue with the 21st century. There have been places where there's been kind of a tension between theology departments and Catholic studies. If the theology department is considered to be too liberal, sometimes the Catholic studies was a response, the creation of a Catholic studies program was in response to that. I don't know what Michael's experience of that might be, very different from this, but I think that it's really important. The other third thing is that with many department chairs of non-theological departments not being trained in Catholic schools or not themselves having any kind of theological background, I think religious studies plays a very important role there in terms of keeping the Catholic tradition alive as it intersects with other departments. So those are some challenges, and I don't know how universal those are, but those are my cautions.
Yeah, I would echo and follow up with the other side of the SWOT analysis in terms of some of the opportunities that come from that. In fact, despite my affiliation in California, I actually live in Knoxville, Tennessee. So one of the cognizant things that I have on my mind is just the changes in universities, especially with regard to conversations around difference. You mentioned polarization earlier, and spaces where those can happen. And one of the opportunities I think I see with Catholic studies is that it can become a hub for conversations around difficult issues, and particularly around things like inequality, power, gender, race, immigration, particularly when other spaces for those kinds of conversation have become scary or tainted or labeled in particular ways. And so I think Catholic studies, because it essentially is a laboratory for all of these kinds of questions and experiences in different environments, it could create an opportunity then to step into some of those spaces. So that I'm optimistic about, but it does require the training, the skill set, and this interdisciplinary conversation across departmental lines.
one of our, well, I like what you just said, Tricia, about Catholic studies as a hub of conversation on difficult issues. And I want to kind of come back to that a little bit later because we want to turn to your thoughts, all of you, about what the field can do and the contributions it can make. But back to this ideological conflict theme for a minute. I mean, we've had one question already submitted, and we were going to go to the questions, the submitted questions later, but I'm going to kind of bring it in here early because we had also planned to ask about internal versus external influences on Catholic studies. And one of the internal influences that we wanted to point to is the increasing conservatism of the priesthood, and that relates to the question that was submitted. I mean, the statistic that we were going to share is that Catholic University of America did a study, the Catholic Project there did a study that found that of priests ordained in the late 60s, 68% of them identified as either progressive or very progressive in theology, whereas among ordinands today, that percentage is almost zero. And so that's a big change. And so that's one thing that it could have an impact on not only the church, but even the field and what it studies. And I'll turn to this submitted question too. The questions reads, there seems to me a distinction between Catholic studies and Catholicism. Based on my experience, what is happening in the church is precisely the opposite of the diversity and decentralization Thuesen and Tricia have mentioned, but rather a retrenchment to authority and the paternalism of the hierarchy. How can scholars navigate this distinction? So, I mean, that seems to relate to this upwelling of conservatism that I was referring to a minute ago. So thoughts on that? And I don't know whether Thuesen or Tricia, you'd like to go first on that?
Now, I'm familiar with that Catholic Project study, and I think it's true, but I would not want to talk about Catholic studies as a conservative priesthood versus a liberal laity, even though it's true that most lay people tend more liberal than what the ordained people are. At least that's what the Catholic Project study showed. Because I think we do have a conservative, there's an ideological split within the laity also. So it's not a laity clergy split, it's a church split, across the board. And that's, I think, what I was referring to, that you have to almost take the Catholic studies programs case by case by case, and and look at it school by school by school, to see why are they established and what is their relationship within this ideological spectrum. So I wouldn't want to generalize too specifically there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'll add too that I led the qualitative portion of that project. So the survey for the priest project was run by Gallup, and my team did more than 100 interviews with priests, and one subsampled from that survey. And to observe that in action, this conservative / progressive split, which largely falls generationally, is really fascinating when you ask why, and you ask priests themselves. I mean, one immediate observation too is that it's not only the church as a whole and lay people who are dealing with this, but also priests. Like how do they talk to each other? Why does one priest show up in shorts to the barbecue at the bishop's house and another shows up in a cassock? And how do you converse? But the thing that I was especially struck by too is the ways in which younger priests narrate their rationale behind this more conservative trend, which oftentimes comes back to this desire to reclaim trust for the church. So to show up in a different way. So if you if you dig into part of what's beneath it, there are some really interesting parallels that I think are not immediately obvious from the ways that we ask about ideology, because in much the same way, Vatican II was this desire to, bring the church into aggiornamento and modernity in response to these sort of broader cultural conditions. And likewise, many younger priests who have been ordained more recently are now trying to understand the climate of abuse and distrust, both between lay people and the ordained, but also priests and their own bishops. And what does it look like to try to reclaim spaces of trust? And then the other piece I'll add too, in terms of lay people, is the importance of mass attendance, meaning that if we talk about American Catholics more broadly, and I think this is one of the challenges that we have in Catholic studies, is just who are we talking about? And anytime we ask questions about who's a good Catholic, that digs even deeper. But mass attendance really matters in the sense that if you're a self-identifying Catholic who attends Mass, you look different in terms of your perceptions and your alignment with the church than Catholics who don't attend Mass. And so I think when we ask those kinds of questions too, generation matters here too, but mass attendance does especially, as well as race and other factors too. So there's so many layers to what Thuesen alluded to in terms of the huge diversity, which in some cases looks like polarization, but also I think there's some surprising links that sometimes the top layer misses.
Mike, are historians are historians again blissfully oblivious or above all of this?
Well, historians, they might think that they're above all this, but they're not. They're in the thick of it. And I think the way that I'll speak for myself as an historian of Catholicism, while we're obviously not in the sociological, contemporary, and theological trenches that my colleagues here are in, we are thinking about the priesthood differently as historians. And I think this is a consequence of a variety of things. One of them is that we don't have many priest historians in the field anymore. It's much, much less common, and which are the founders of sort of Catholic Church history during the early 20th century and really through most of the 20th century. The shape of the field has become much more lay-driven since Vatican II. And if we're thinking of it generationally, though the generation that were working as historians in the 1960s and 1970s and even into the 1980s, they were much driven by this progressive Catholicism that had this momentum coming out of Vatican II, whether they were priests or not. And they were typically, if they weren't clergy, they were friends with and colleagues with with clergy. And they were kind of like partners at arms in driving this new historiography that was posing questions to the past in really different ways through social history, informed by the civil rights movement, informed by feminism, informed by all the things that made the 60s and 70s really interesting. And that's kind of past now. But there is still a legacy of that present today. The second feature of the way in which I think people today, historians today, are thinking about the priesthood is in light of the clerical sex abuse scandals of what kind of started to bubble up in the 1980s, actually in the Diocese of Lafayette in Louisiana, and then really we know the rest of the story. I think that allowed historians to finally realize that priests are dudes. Not that they weren't thinking of them in that way beforehand, but now it was kind of cracked open. They weren't just automatons of the church, institution builders, church builders, and theologically sophisticated and always right men. And that has allowed historians, I think, to think much more critically about the practice of the priesthood and the role of priests, along with all of the other ways in which Catholics experience their Catholicism and experience the world around them. As for this trend towards a more conservative priesthood, I think that also informs historians of Catholicism today, in that we're all very much aware of it. And I think we'd be fooling ourselves as historians to think that we aren't shaped or motivated by the cultural and social currents, both within the church and outside of the church, and what questions we pose to the past.
when we think of Catholic studies, though, I think we're talking about a lay movement more than a clerical movement in the field, because there are very few priests teaching in our colleges and universities today, or chairing departments, or even being presidents of these institutions. So, I think the Catholic studies movement is as we move into the future, is really a lay movement. And it's not in so much a dialogue with the conservative clergy, but it's people who care deeply about the tradition. And then the question is, how are they going to interpret that tradition and bring it into conversation with contemporary life?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you both reflect on the role of priests as academics effectively too. One of the books I have on my desk is One Man Research by Joe Fichter. And this is, he actually wrote 2 autobiographies reflecting on his own life as a priest, sociologist, at a particular moment. And he is gone now, but it is fascinating to look back at that. And one of the through lines, of course, I see in that still is, even as lay people enter into this space more and more and really guide the direction of this field, at least for sociologists, we often are still the troublemakers. We are the ones asking these hard questions. We are the ones with the bad news of lay Catholics not necessarily aligned with church teachings and the like. And my optimism, though, is that unlike with Joe Fichter, who really, he went through a lot trying to navigate that. And I think likewise, there's some of that happens now, but I think the hope is that there are institutional hubs and spaces, and even diocese and institutional contexts in the church where those kinds of questions are seen as valuable and needed in order to move forward. So that bad news is actually part of the puzzle. But we absolutely do stand on big shoulders, I think, for the legacy in terms of the shape of our field as it took place.
On the theme of scholars bringing bad news, I mean, Mike was alluding earlier to the sex abuse scandal. I mean, does anything more need to be said about that and how that changes the agenda or the method of Catholic studies? I mean, he commented on it some, but
yeah, it is the ever-present backdrop in many ways. It is. I mean, my dissertation book was about a lay Catholic movement that mobilized in response to the crisis of abuse in the church, most of whom were baby boomers. And now, waves after waves of revelation have called upon emerging generations then to step into this space. But I think it also raises questions too about retention, affiliation, deep skepticism, transparency, accountability. And I do think those questions are being contended with at the highest levels of the church, as it were. I think, again, looping back to the idea of the Synod on Synodality and its effort to integrate modes of transparency and accountability, I think it has been deeply impactful on the church. And I think it's unfinished. And I think that's part of the task of Catholic studies as well, to continue to ask what's happening, what it looks like, and what the implications are.
Others?
Thuesen, you want to jump in?
No, I don't think so. I was just, sitting here thinking about how am I using Catholic studies the same way as the other panelists? Because when I'm thinking of Catholic studies, I'm thinking of programs, that offer certificates and degrees. I'm not talking about the more general understanding of Catholic studies as diffused within a school. So I don't know if that makes a difference with this or not.
Well, Susan, actually, I think we could come back to that in just a minute, but let me ask if Mike, did you want to add anything to the?
Yeah, I do. And I think it builds on what I was saying earlier. I think that over the last 2 decades and the revelations and the research that has come out of questions or research specifically on clerical sex abuse. I'm thinking of bishopsaccountability.org I'm thinking, which is an incredible repository driven by a very important layperson who has, if anyone knows Terry, he's a wonderful human being. These kinds of services that, again, kind of go to Susan's point, that are lay driven, and then the involvement of and the cooperation with historians to pose questions to this real tradition within the Catholic Church, which involves clerical sex abuse. And I have many colleagues who are involved in this, Jack Downey and Kathleen Holscher, among many others. But I think we can broaden that out. In what I was previously saying, not only does the clerical sex abuse problem require us to think about clerical sex abuse, I think it also demands of us that we think about the priesthood and priests differently as well. And I think that has allowed us a kind of entree into understanding the relationships and the networks of Catholicism at very small scales. You know, Tricia mentioned Joseph Fichter. I'm in New Orleans right now. I'm reminded of his book Southern Parish, which was he didn't name New Orleans, but everybody knew it was New Orleans. And that was a really important book in mid 20th century, of a Jesuit priest, who was thinking really critically about race and the problem of race and racism in a Southern parish, but really I think it was applicable to the rest of the United States. So when we think about clerical sex abuse, I think it just reminds us of all of the worldliness and the humanness of this institution called Catholicism. And I think it allows us, it frees us from more restrictive or even simplistic ideas of how Catholicism functions in people's lives, and sometimes really traumatic and awful ways.
I'm wondering if what we're looking at too is kind of a difference or a distinction between Catholicism as an institution and Catholicism as a faith tradition. That when we're talking about clerical abuse and the institution and accountability and those kinds of structures, ecclesial structures. And then again, in terms of how I'm using Catholic studies in my head, what that is really, I see that as an immersion in the tradition more than the institution, as it translates in its disciplinary nature.
Right. And of course, what you're saying can lead into different scholarly directions and topics too, which is a segue into this issue of where the field should go, or where you would like to see it go in the future. I want to give you each at least a quick opportunity to comment on that before maybe we turn to some of the submitted questions again. And Megan, you may want to take over there, but we had asked you to think ahead of time about your own wish list for the field. I mean, you've touched on some things here, that some possible directions for research or ways that internal and external influences may be redirecting research. But are there other things that haven't come up in this conversation? Tricia looks like she's about to say something.
I'm happy to hop in here. We need all the resources, all the money, Peter. Just no.
Besides money, though. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
No,
exactly.
I know. That's so true.
No, there is. I think there is some legitimate fear of that will disappear. That will. I mean, in much the same way that previously there was such a high influence of priests, scholars who were in spaces shaping these fields that we have now, as lay people, stepped into ourselves. I look behind me and say, where are the lay people? Part of that is generational. Where does interest in something like Catholic studies come from? To what extent does that overlap with a Catholic background? We're now in the U.S. context looking at emerging generations, most of whom are not growing up in Catholic households or even religious households or practicing households, which is neither here nor there in terms of Catholic studies. But I do ask, okay, where are the colleagues behind me? I'm also on the heels of a broad conversation around open science and open data practices and sharing. And so when I think about the ways that we can help to have our studies talk to each other and to broader publics who are in different spaces, practitioners and the like, part of that means both showing our notes and sharing our studies and finding ways for us to not gatekeep the work that we do such that it can have a higher impact. I would love to see Catholic studies move in that direction to be able to support the work of current and future scholars, as well as those who are using it in other meaningful ways. But I am concerned. I do think back to the inflection point. I wonder what happens from here, seeing departmental changes at universities and institutional pulses that I think are a counter trend to encouraging the perpetual success and thriving of our own disciplines.
And you're right. I mean, it does come back to resources and money there. And I mean, actually one of the submitted questions has to do with that, institutional closures. And so we might come back to that. But are other possible wishes for the field? And, I just ask you to comment on them quickly, and then maybe we'll turn to the submitted questions.
Well, I would like to go back to the whole notion of a synodal methodology within Catholic studies and the possible implementation of that, which is respectful conversation across difference. And I think one of the needs today is to address the intense polarization in our church, and whether that's lay versus ordained, whether it's factions within the church, whether it's traditionalist versus progressionist. And my hope would be that Catholic studies programs, which is where my emphasis is, would not choose one polarity over the other, but take it upon themselves to create the space to critically examine both poles and to give students the critical apparatus for coming to good judgments themselves.
Thank you.
Peter, for the purposes of time, why don't we just jump into the questions and hear from the folks, unless...
Okay. Yeah. All right. Megan, have you, I'm terrible at multitasking, but have you scrolled through, I mean, we can turn to some.
I put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I can ramble. I can respond to it if you all need some time to think about it.
No, it's fine. There's a few questions. Thank you very much to everyone who has submitted questions. And we do have quite a few very interesting ones. I'll read that one in a second. Now, there was one that came in that may be interesting. One of our viewers was wondering, what are we doing with spin-off groups like the Roman Catholic women priests, specifically looking at their theology, their ethical stances, or their liturgical practices? So I guess, how is Catholic studies engaging with these Catholic groups? Maybe they're more on the margins of the institution.
Well, I can start by saying that I think within the field of Catholic studies, from coming from religious studies and history, I think that we've been taking that rather seriously. In that I'm reminded of Julie Burns' scholarship on independent Catholics and others who have a more inclusive understanding of Catholicism. Going back to my time when I was the unit leader, the program leader in Catholic studies at AAR. It was while I was there that we decided to change the name from Roman Catholic Studies Unit to Catholic Studies Unit, precisely for this reason. So I do think that within some pockets of Catholic studies, there's great openness to thinking outside of traditional institutional parameters by which we understand the Catholic tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of my fascinating observations from the Synod is that so much of what was happening there and the networks that were emergent in Rome in that space at that time were not just in the hall. You know, it was all of these groups descending upon this space and this moment to speak into it. So Discerning Deacons, Women's Ordination Conference, New Ways Ministry, you know, all of these sort of groups who are likewise trying to think through what is the nature of this, you know, to Susan's points earlier, this sort of the theology and the doctrinal questions and what the church is that way, but also structurally, what is it? So many different layers to that conversation. And I think as a sociologist, you know, trying to be attuned to that, it is really a key part of what we do, who and what is Catholic, and where do those definitions come from, and what do they mean? I would also tie into one of the other questions that is raised in the chat here about reducing Catholicism to just another discourse, because I think there is a risk to say that if we are constantly pointing to it's not really about what the church is, it's about all these other factors, whether it's about gender, race, or class, or other types of variables and discourse that might be out there, then we might be missing something about what is actually distinctive about Catholicism. And so I think that's where sociologists too need to be especially attuned to, okay, what is the actual Catholicism qua Catholicism? What is something that's actually distinctive here that is not just explained away by these other groups and questions and structural elements that we likewise have to pay attention to?
Thank you. Tricia, thank you for bringing up that particular question, because that was where I was going to go next. So I'll open it up to Susan and Michael. I can read the question. Contemporary training in religious studies relies heavily on critical theory and guards against theology. And the viewer puts in parentheses, I'm generalizing here. This can tend to reduce Catholicism to just another discourse. Is there a way in which the Catholic intellectual tradition can respond to this reduction?
Well, I think that's a danger, and I think that's a point of potential conflict between the theology department and religious studies, if that is in fact the methodology of religious studies. And so again, I understand religious studies as taking this, I want to call it a wonderful tradition, you know, and looking at its intersection with science and history and literature, and seeing how it's embodied, and, you know, and to use the theological word, that's the sacramentalization, if you will, of the tradition as it, you know, comes to light in these other disciplines. And takes it out of the theology department and expands it rather than reducing it. And to me, I mean, again, I speak from kind of strong faith claims, you know, as a theologian, and I think that's what we need to be doing. So to me, it can't be just another discourse. Then you're not talking about Catholic studies, you're talking about, you know, religious studies generally rather than theology.
I would respond with a quick anecdote and then maybe a little analysis. So one time I was applying for a job and I was doing an on-campus interview in a theology department, and I went like the whole day and a half, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, you know, the entire time you were here, you never said the word theology. And I was like, you got me. But so, you know, there is that kind of disciplinary tension, if not like allergy, I think sometimes. That being said, I have two wonderful colleagues, maybe about a decade ago, we're all getting older, Amy Collinger and Janine Hill-Fletcher. Amy Collinger is at Oregon State, Janine is at Fordham, and they came together as program leaders at AAR for Catholic Studies, and they quite intentionally, and this is a place where we can kind of shape a field, and they did this for 6 years, where they were very intentional about not just them two coming from a theological and ethical discipline, and then from a historical and religious studies discipline, to represent that in their partnership and then manifest that through the programs that they developed. And I do think that there is a healthy interdisciplinarity within Catholic studies that does also have room for the more sort of hyper analytic and deconstructive forces of religious studies, but also the features of this, I think, rather inclusive field that can play in the same sandbox with theologians and ethicists and historians and religious studies folks, and come out of it in really constructive and I think really interesting ways. And I think I think in some pockets of our field, we've demonstrated that.
Well, this is to say that theology should be part of Catholic studies, you know, that it should not be apart from theology, but include theology. I'm unbiased, of course.
I think we have about 2 minutes left, so we'll do one more quick question. This was addressed specifically for Michael, but I think we can open up for Tricia and Thuesen as well as it applies to your respective fields. So the question reads, Michael, beyond the underexplored archives such as Black, Native American, and Latino, what are other historiographical gaps in the field that you could see emerging in the future?
It's like the age-old question. I was in preparing for this, I went back to sort of just every 5 or 10 years, there's a really important essay, like a, you know, new directions in Catholic studies, new directions in Catholic history, new directions in Catholic, you name it. And what I kind of found in a kind of tertiary quick glance through them is that they were all kind of just kept saying the same thing over and over again. We need to think about we need to think more about Latinx Catholicism. We think more about African American Catholicism. We need to think more about Native American Catholicism, or the manifestation, how Catholicism inflects within a diversity of people's lives. And to be quite honest, we're still kind of there. I don't want to tout this radical innovativeness within Catholic studies. I think the hard work continues in thinking about a multiplicity of voices and a multiplicity of perspectives. And I think that work needs to continue. And I think that it's not an exciting answer to the question, but I think the work continues, and for really good reason.
I would say gender. Gender is a huge area that's not mentioned here.
Yeah, I think there are so many gaps and sort of the interstices of the ways that we practice what we do vis-a-vis faith. And in the case of the Catholic Church, what does it look like to practice Catholicism with a home altar? What does it mean for the huge array with great diversity therein of Asian and Pacific Islander Catholics who are bringing traditions, 3/4 of whom are first generation Americans? What does that look like, and how do we miss that? And even when it comes to the structural spaces, we're now looking at the immense retraction of physical material space, Catholic spaces, so parishes closing, and quite frankly, not enough resources to be able to preserve any of those archives either. And where do those Catholics go? What does Catholic practice look like? We know anytime a parish closes that there is the community reduces, right? Even as they're sort of moved around into another place, there's no such thing as parish closure. You just redraw the lines, but something gets missed. And my fear, back to my less than optimistic outlook here, is that even as a sociologist, increasingly, what I'm doing is trying to learn to be a historian, or learning to do the work now that can be used in the future, because we're trying to pick up pieces and capture things where we can. And I do think that we miss a lot. Some of that comes from positionality too, increasing the diversity of our own field by way of language, race, and ethnicity. I think will also help us to fill some of those gaps and tell a different story, a different Catholic story.
Well, I want to thank all of you for this rich conversation. I know I've learned a lot from the interdisciplinary nature of this. And you see on the screen there, please click on the link provided in the chat to complete a short survey and let us know what questions you have and other resources and topics you'd like to see, and you'll receive that link shortly. And we also want to encourage you to stay tuned for the next episode, Religion and Obsolescence, featuring Christian Smith, and that's next month. Last but not least, this recorded webinar will be available on YouTube, the center's YouTube channel, along with all the other webinars we've run. And so it's a rich repository. And thank all of you once again for making this such a great conversation. And thanks, Megan, for co-hosting it with me.